morning everyone. Today I'm going to be reviewing the TT Artisan 14mm f2.8 lens. Now this is a full frame lens, 14mm, so it could be used on APS-C, which will be at a approximate focal length of 21mm. Now it's a manual focus, but don't let that put you off because it has several advantages, especially at this focal length. So at 14mm, if you're using this lens for astrophotography, you can just turn the focus ring round to infinity and you know that your stars are going to be sharp. So that's one good advantage. And also the other great advantage you can have with a manual focus lens like this, of fixed focal length, is that you get the depth of field scale, and the depth of field scale allows you to do hyperfocal focusing. Now I'll explain more about this later and give you a demonstration. So this lens is available in Canon RF mount, Sony E mount, Nikon Z mount and L mount, which is for Sigma, Leica and Panasonic cameras. So this lens is very solidly made. It has a lot of metal, it's got a plastic cap at one end, and then on the other end you can either unscrew this lens cap here, and that gives you a kind of hood which you can screw filters into, but you need slim filters for this lens, as I'll find out later in this video. Or you can unscrew this whole hood thing as well and leave yourself with that, which is obviously going to be a bit more prone to flare, I'd have thought. So on sunny days when the sun's likely to be on the edge of the frame or something, you're probably best to have this hood on. Now it's a bit strange having a screw-on lens cap, but I soon got used to this after using it for the last few weeks and found it to be no problem at all. So I'm going to be comparing this lens, the TT Artisan 14mm f2.8, which is a low-priced lens. The price in dollars is $196. It's a very good quality lens for that kind of price. £145 here in the UK. I'm going to be comparing that to the Schneider Samyang, as you can see, a larger lens, but this is a zoom lens which goes from 14 to 24mm, and it also costs approximately 9 times the price. But I thought, what's the point in doing a review of a lens, even a great quality budget lens like this, unless you've got something to compare it to? So I know admittedly you should really compare a lens like the TT Artisan to something of similar price, but I don't have anything. I've only got this Schneider Samyang, which is a much more expensive lens and also a zoom, so it's much more convenient, but at 9 times the price you've got to expect that. It's really beautifully made. I mean, it is quite solid. I weighed it with both lens caps on at 495 grams. And I'll put the pounds on the screen because I don't know what that is in pounds for you Americans. So TT Artisans sent me this lens to a review, but it's going to be a totally independent review. I'm going to say exactly what I think of it. This is a rectilinear lens, so not a fisheye. So as long as you keep the camera perfectly level, the trees will be straight, as you can see. This TT Artisan's 14mm lens has an 8-blade aperture, so you can see what the sun stars are like. So compare that to the Schneider Samyang, which has a 9-blade aperture, which obviously gives you more streaks coming out from the sun. So if sun stars are your thing, that's worth taking into consideration. The lens seems to handle flare pretty well. So I'm pointing into quite a large sun at the moment at f8. And if I just put my finger into the frame, you can see the flare there at the end of my finger. If I block the sun out, you can see how that goes away. But I think that's a pretty good result, really. It certainly seems to be as good as the Schneider Samyang at 14mm. I'll be using a Sony a7R5, which is 61 megapixels, so keep that in mind when you see these results, because if you've got fewer megapixels, obviously it won't matter as much. But this will really show up any possible defects in this lens. And I'll be comparing this to the Schneider Samyang 14 to 24mm f2.8 at 14mm. If we look at the full wall that I photographed using this 14mm lens, you can see that there's very little barrel distortion, so that's a great result for video shooters who may want to do interior work, something like that, because the lack of distortion is excellent. If you compare that to the full wall of the Schneider Samyang, you'll notice the barrel distortion, which is of course easily corrected in post-production, but video shooters cannot do that anywhere near as easily. Notice also the warm colours of the Schneider Samyang compared to the cooler colours of the TT Artisan. However, that really doesn't mean anything because you can easily adjust the temperature later on in Photoshop if you're shooting raw. If we look at the first image now at f2.8, this is the centre of the image and it's slightly milky, slightly soft, but this is to be expected from a budget lens like this. So it's still a pretty good result, I think. f4 sharpens everything up and gives it more contrast. f5.6 gives a slight improvement in image sharpness. f8 is the same as f5.6. f11 starts to go downhill slightly, but only very slightly. It's a microscopic difference. And at f16 it starts to go soft again because of the effects of diffraction. So if we look at the f2.8 image again, this is the centre of the image, and then compare that to the Schneider Samyang, you'll see the Schneider Samyang is noticeably more contrasty, sharper, but you'd expect that because it costs, 9 times more than this TT Artisan's 14mm. If we compare both lenses at f8 in the centre, you'll see that the Schneider Samyang is slightly more sharp and has better contrast. But still, this is a very good result from a 14mm budget lens. Right, let's move over to the image corners now. And at f2.8, it's the same kind of story as the centre of the image. So slightly soft. If we compare that to the Schneider Samyang at f2.8, you can see that it's much sharper, but then that's to be expected. So the TT Artisans did the same thing in the corners as it did in the middle. So it gradually got sharper. At f8 seemed to be the best result. So if you want sharp corners, this lens is really good. It's still not quite as sharp as the Schneider Samyang, but don't forget that's 9 times more expensive. So it's a good result in the corners apart from at f2.8. Chromatic aberration was fairly minimal on this lens and it can easily be corrected anyway in Photoshop. Right, well that's quite enough of staring at brick walls, so let's take it out into the field. So I went to Wheelcoats tin mine and I waited for the sunset and I took this really nice shot and I really like it. The clouds were filling up the sky nicely. It's a really well balanced shot and I was so pleased with it. And I thought I'd try a 10-stop filter on this TT Artisan's 14mm lens, and it wasn't a slim filter, and as you can see from this next shot, it's got vignetting in the corners, so it's fairly bad. So I think to use this lens you either have to use an ultra slim filter, which I didn't have with me at the time, or there might be some other way of doing it, I'm not sure yet. But anyway, this image was easily corrected in Photoshop and it's an outstandingly good image, so one for my website. I was very pleased with that. And then I went back to Wheelcoats on another day just to test the lens even further and to show you the hyperfocal focusing distance. So I found another composition and it's this gorse and heather. The heather's going slightly over, but these grasses here are just so magnificent and they balance out the engine house over here really nicely. So yeah, it's a good shot I think, and because the foreground's so strong I'm going to make sure it's pin sharp, and I don't really care if the engine house goes slightly soft because there's no way I can get the gorse here, which is a foot away from the lens. There's no way I can get that and the engine house sharp. So I'll focus on this gorse using the magnifier. Oh, that's beautiful. So I want that to be pin sharp, right from the bottom of the frame. So focusing on that. that's saying it's 1.5 feet away on the distance scale. So it doesn't matter whether the distance scale is accurate or not. So my focusing point is on the 1 of the 1.5 there. It's dead in line with that there. Right, so here's how hyperfocal focusing works. So you can see that I've got an aperture set of f8 there, you see, 8 lines up with that white line there. Now, if I was focused on infinity, I would get everything on between these two 8s here on the depth of field scale in sharp focus. So I'd get between 3 and 4 feet on the yellow there is within the 8, probably 4 is within the 8, and then I'd get to infinity and beyond there in the 8 is in sharp focus. Now to make more of the foreground, obviously I can bring the infinity mark round to within the 8, which is my chosen aperture. There's the infinity mark now within the 8, and now I've got just over 2 feet in the close focus distance in sharp focus. So I hope that makes sense. Now if I bring the aperture round to f16, I can bring this infinity mark round to the 16 mark on the depth of field scale there. And now I'll get even more depth of field, you see. So now I'm getting between 1.5 and 2 feet. So about 1.75 feet on the yellow scale is now within these 16s. So let me just explain that again. So last night at the engine house and the heather and gorse were focused on the 1 of the 1.5, so I was focusing there. Now if I was using an aperture of f16 and I just left it on that, I would get this here, 1.2 would be in sharp focus, but I don't need that in sharp focus, and I'd get over 2 feet in sharp focus because they're between the 16s. So to make the most of it, you use the hyperfocal distance. So you bring the 1 of the 1.5, which is our sharp closest focus point, round to within the 16s. There you see, 1 of the 1.5 between the 16s. And now you get 3 meters or between 4 and 10 feet on the yellow scale in sharp focus. So you get much more sharp focus if you use this hyperfocal scale correctly. Now you can do this with an app, but obviously it's much easier if you've got a nice manual focus lens like this to just do it on the lens. You can see what you're doing. It's just so easy. So that's hyperfocal focusing. Now just to show you a bit more, there's the 1 of the 1.5, which was my close focusing point. If I was on an aperture of f8, obviously you'd bring the 1 of the 1.5 round to the closest 8 here, which is, yeah, so that's about there. And now I'd get up to almost 3 feet within the 8ths of the depth of field scale. That's hyperfocal focusing. So I could obviously focus stack this, but I didn't really want to. I just think the foreground's so strong it doesn't really matter so much about the background. So now it's just a case of waiting for the light, because while I've been doing this, the sun's gone in, of course, which is typical. I think it's worth waiting for this one. The other great thing you can do with a 14mm lens, as I showed in my review of the Schneider Samyang 14 to 24mm zoom lens, is you can just get the camera down really low and then just crop the top and the bottom off the frame. And I made this cardboard mask with black cardboard, and you can just slot it over there so you can compose easily. I like to try and keep the camera level because then you don't get so much distortion. And then you can just compose that way, and once you get the image back to the office, you can just crop it. And even if you've got a 24 megapixel sensor, you can still get a 10 megapixel image, something like that. So it'll still be good enough for printing up to maybe that sort of size. So fine, totally fine. So I'm going to do that, but of course I got to wait for the sun again because it keeps going behind a cloud. I'm a little bit disappointed that I haven't had a chance to test this lens for astro work, but we've had so few clear skies in Cornwall recently, and I haven't been available on any of those nights. So if you want to find out what it's really like for astro, I'd recommend looking at somebody else's review, maybe Christopher Frost. He's a great reviewer based in Britain here. So I enjoyed very much having a couple of weeks with this TT Artisan 14mm f2.8 lens. And do I recommend it? Who is it for? Well, I think because of the incredibly low price of £145, it's for anyone who wants to supplement their existing lens system with an ultra-wide lens. And I think providing you use it at f5.6 or f8 on high megapixel cameras, then you will really do well with this. Now, if you're using it for occasional astro, it'll be fine for that as well. But if you're going to take astro seriously, you want to probably get an f1.8 or f1.4 even better. But you'll have to spend quite a bit more money to get a lens which is better than this. So I think this is a great supplemental lens for anyone who hasn't got this focal length. And I think it works well at f5.6 and f8 on a really testing kind of sensor like the Sony that I've been using on, the 61 megapixel A7R5. But the fact that it worked pretty well on that camera goes to show how good it is. So I would recommend it. It's great value for money, but obviously you can get better if you spend quite a lot more money.